So we are getting close to start time. Oh, it just ticked over to 1 o'clock. Let's go ahead and start. Let's be respectful of folks' time. We want to, I think we're the first. This is the hour zero, right? So it's exciting.
We're
I'm,
kicking it off.
yeah, I'm delighted. So, hi everyone. I'm Jen Spurko. I have a couple of podcasts. One is called My Favorite Character. One is called Be Gay Do Piracy. But I am delighted that I have folks who know a little bit more about that, and I'm delighted to turn it over to them. I'm talking to my pronouns are she, her, and I'm talking to you from East Tennessee. And I'm happy to introduce our panelists today. We have Valerie Valdez, who is her pronouns are she, her, and she's talking to us from Georgia. Her debut novel, Chilling Effect, was shortlisted for the 2021 Arthur C. Clarke Award. Woo! And also named one of the Library Journal's best SF fantasy books of 2019. So, way to go, Valerie. And she co edits Escape Pod, which some of you may be familiar with, and has had short fiction and poetry featured in several sources, including Uncanny, Time Travel Short Stories, and Nightmare Magazine. And I love the fact that you mentioned you had cats as part of your family, Valerie. I have some too. And then I'd also love to welcome Jean Paul Garnier, who is his pronouns are he, him, and he's coming to us from Joshua Tree, California, where we've been talking about the beautiful flowers out there. He owns Space Cowboy Books, a science fiction bookstore, independent publisher, and is a producer of the Simultaneous Times podcast, which, again, many of you may know of. His first novella came out in 2020. That's Garbage In, Gospel Out. And in 2018, Traveling Shoes Press released Echo of Creation, which is a collection of science fiction short stories. And he has several collections of speculative poetry, which is a genre I'm incompetent at writing, but fascinated to read. And those include Future Anthropology, Ode to Scientists, Beetlejuice, Dimming, and Utopian Problems. He's a 5-time Elgin Award nominee and has appeared in the 2020 Dwarf Stars and a 2021 Riesling anthologies. Um, and there's a little bit more, I'm sure, that both of them could say about that. I did want to mention that you have probably, if you've been keeping up with the Dream Foundry blog, you may have read some of Jean Paul's writing there as well. So welcome to both of you. I'm glad that you're here, and I'm delighted that we're kind of starting off this conference with one of my very favorite things. So let me ask each of you, and if you want to say more about your work, that would be great. I know those intros were quite brief. Um, and we'll start, I think, just in the same order of introduction. So Valerie and then Jean Paul. Tell us why you got into podcasting. Like, what interested you about this format?
All right. So for me, it was that I was approached to be co-editor of Escape Pod, and so that was sort of my sideways slide into this. Previously, I had experience as more of a Twitch streamer, and it's a Twitch video game variety streamer, which is a very different kind of thing from a podcast, like Escape Pod especially, because of course there are a lot of different kinds of podcasts. You have ones that are sort of self-help podcasts, you have entertainment podcasts, and Escape Pod is specifically a narrative short fiction podcast. And so coming on board to that was very cool. I had never been an editor before in this way, and it was exciting to be able to have not just the capacity to choose stories that I wanted to share with other people, but also to help produce them in audio format so that they can be experienced in multiple ways, because we do typically post the text on the website as well as releasing the audio for podcast consumption. And so having it both ways, I think, is really delightful. I was super into that. And otherwise, like I enjoy podcasts. I enjoy listening to them. The kinds of podcasts that I tend towards sometimes are also streamed on Twitch, and there's a fun interactivity with that. But just being able to kind of consume the stories and immerse yourself in them in a way is very fun. And
Thanks, Jean Paul.
So in a previous life, I had been an audio engineer before running the bookstore, and one of the aspirations for the bookstore had always been to get into publishing, which we have. We've done a few anthologies and paperbacks and chapbooks, um, but publishing can be quite expensive and difficult and time consuming. And I had thought I'd grown up listening to science fiction radio dramas from the 40s and 50s, things like X minus one, and I mean that was my introduction to genre fiction when I was a little kid because I had a little AM radio, and there was an AM station that played radio dramas right at my bedtime, which was just perfect. You know, all kinds of things, crime, Yukon adventure, but it was the science fiction ones that and horror that really got me. Um, and so it just kind of made sense with the skill set that I had to start producing audio fiction. And the big catalyst for me was finding a program on archive.org that had aired in the 70s and early 80s called MindWebs. And they had such a neat style of production. I listened to that. I said, we've got to do something like this. And I happen to have some friends that are amazing composers. And I had a recording set up. I said, let's read some stories and put some music to them and start creating audio fiction, immersive experiences.
I would love if you get a chance, and maybe not during the discussion, but maybe after, if you could drop a link to MindWebs, because I'm not familiar with that, and I wonder if that's true of some of our some of the folks in the room as well. Um, to go back and revisit that. I love how you called it a sideways slide, Valerie. I think a lot of folks have gotten into podcasting that way. Well, thank you so much for telling me those stories. It's fascinating to me. I think there's many ways of getting into podcasting as there are podcasts, it seems. Um, and I know that folks in the chat are going to have, or folks in the room are going to have a lot of questions and a lot of thoughts. But I'd like to kick things off with just kind of some basic questions. And we'll go in reverse order this time. So John Paul and then Valerie, what is the best way to get started? Like we know how you got started. Um, Recommending it to other folks in terms of the nitty gritty, right? Like what would you say are the important first steps?
Well, most importantly is great stories. So reach out to your author friends, read a lot. You know, you could team up with other magazines that don't have their own fiction podcasts. So the stories is the most important thing. Without stories, you don't have a podcast. If we're doing narrative poetry, that is. If it's a more chatty podcast, then just find yourself some great guests, talk to the people whose work that you love, and bring them in. So that's at the core of everything. You know, I feel the same way at the bookstore. It's nothing without writers. They're the most important part. So reaching out to writers you love and let them know that you would like to adapt their stories. You know, the other super basic is you need some way to record, but these days that's pretty easy. You can start with just your phone or your laptop, and you know, you don't have to. I think there's a tendency to want to get carried away in the tech and spend a lot of money, um, and that's not the greatest way to start. I mean, like it's similar to playing an instrument or something. You know, I always say like buy the worst guitar that you can find if you want to play guitar. If you learn how to play on that, you can play any guitar. If you know, you don't buy a Ferrari for your first car. So, you know, you use what's in front of you and learn the tools and read tutorials. There's plenty of online classes that you can take for free. So it can be overwhelming to start, but I think you always start with what's right in front of you.
Valerie?
Yeah, so I absolutely that, because if you're not fully committed to doing the thing, if you're exploring it, which is a very normal human thing to do, right? Then throwing a bunch of money at it initially could mean that you have now thrown a bunch of money at something that you decide you do not actually love doing. And so definitely like find a way to dip your toes into it, find a way to get the experience of doing the thing without going all out and overboard. But other stuff to think about, just very kind of technical things, I guess. Um, a name, you want to have a name for your podcast. Try to check for your name on Google to see if it's already in use. If you search for Escape Pod, you'll find more than one thing. If you search for Podcastle, you'll find more than one thing. It can get very tough to find a name that isn't already in use, and you just don't want to have that complication down the road if you can avoid it. Once you have the name, a good thing to think about, and again, this is like assuming you are like really invested in doing the thing as opposed to still kind of dipping your toes in it. But domain parking, get a website domain, get your social media accounts in order. If you're going to do like a newsletter or mailing list, get that started up. Discord. Again, this is all very like nitty gritty stuff that you don't have to do to just do the thing, but it's stuff you can think about. Episode format. like depending on what kind of thing you're doing, if you're doing a narrative podcast, if you're doing a chatty podcast, what is the format going to be like? Do you want an intro, an outro? What kinds of components are you going to have? Are you going to have music? Like Jean Paul said, like, are you going to have a composer friend? Or are you going to look for stuff that's in the public domain that you can use? If it's an ongoing narrative in episodes, are you going to have recaps maybe at the beginning? Are there any legal disclaimers or specific segments that you want to have that are repeated? And if you're going to have guests, as was brought up, trying to line up as many as possible, or at least have a list of people that you're going to try to reach out to, really good. And if you're going to have having a database of narrator really helpful. We have one for all the Escape Artist podcasts, so that when we're looking for a specific kind of voice, we have already kind of a stable of people that we can reach out to, and hopefully get started in that. Um, I think that'll do you.
If I could just add to that, to
Yeah,
what
go for
Valerie
it. Go for
said,
it.
um, choosing these things is something really worth putting some thought into first, because you're basically going to be stuck with it, especially if it takes off. For instance, simultaneous times sums up my podcast wonderfully, because I'm obsessed with time travel. However, a lot of people have a difficult time spelling or saying the word simultaneous, including myself. And I hadn't thought about that initially until I had the person record our intro, and he said, "Do I really have to say this word out loud?" And so it's really worth thinking about on the long term, if you're going to be happy with the name decisions and your intro music and all of that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like, really take time on the name, especially if you're going to be setting up, Twitter, Instagram, whatever social media is, buying a domain because you don't want to have to, redo all that work. But I was chuckling when you said simultaneous, because my first podcast I actually did for the library I worked for had a really simple name, Beyond the Shelves, and I could not say it. Every time we started to record, I would say behind the shelves, or some other preposition. So pick something you can live with. I think is great. Is very, very great advice. Um, so I see that we have a question. I'm going to scroll up here. Let me see if this is something I want to. Okay, so this is actually a good question, because I did want to touch on this. Um, I think keep in mind, I think what Valerie said, and oh no, John Paul said, what if you're going to learn, get the worst guitar. Um, if you watch videos and stuff, they're going to say, well, you need this $300 mic. It's the only kind of mic you can use. It's the best. Probably don't start with the $300 mic. So what do you start with? What equipment would you recommend for someone, let's say, who's reached that point where they really are committed, they've come up with a name, they want to jump in. What is absolutely necessary for starting? And we'll go again. We'll flip the order again and start with Valerie. And I'm thinking software as well as hardware. So, like, how do you record? What program are you recording in? All that sort of stuff.
Okay, so if you wanted to be, I'll say, if you wanted to be a narrator for Escape Pod, because that is a different kind of tier of I want to make I want to make videos for TikTok, which, like Jean Paul said, you can do it on your phone. You don't need anything special. You do want to have a good microphone. It doesn't have to be a super expensive microphone. But honestly, an internet search is your friend here, because new microphones come out all the time. You don't need to have a new one though. The cool thing about microphones is that as long as they still function with the computer technology as it is today, you can honestly buy a used one and it is probably okay. My husband is a sound guy and he has microphones that are like 10 years old and are still amazing. It really, like, you don't have to have something new. So that's one thing to think about, the secondary market. Although sometimes they retain value because they are still great. But just Googling an internet search will help you find a good microphone. People are willing to help. A pop screens are good to have. They will keep you from making gross noises. A good acoustic space. This one not super hot right now, but my husband's working on it. We just moved. Editing software. So that was the specific question here. You can have something as simple as like Audacity or GarageBand and do a fine job. There are free options. You don't have to go all out. If you want to pay money for things, you can have something like Pro Tools or Adobe Audition, but Audacity will do you. I mean, and honestly, when I'm doing my host spots for stuff, I use GarageBand on my phone. I have a microphone like that I use, but that'll do the thing. And yeah, Jean Paul.
So Audacity is wonderful freeware. I still use it for mixing the podcast, particularly for mixing. It's a very powerful tool. Um, Most DAWs are fairly similar. Oh, and it will work for Mac and Microsoft, I believe. Most DAWs, digital audio workstations, are pretty similar. So if you learn one, you can pretty much transfer those skills over to another. So it's great to start with something like Audacity or GarageBand before you graduate towards one of the more expensive programs like Logic or Pro Tools or Audition. As far as microphones go, I'm using a Perception 120 here, which is 15 years old. I bought it for $100 new. This is a condenser mic, though. I'm fortunate to live in a fairly quiet area. The thing about condenser mics is they will pick up everything in the vicinity. So if you live in a noisy area, you might consider a dynamic microphone. And those you can get for fairly cheap. If you don't have the money to buy a microphone, you could always start with something like this or a headset. It doesn't have to be super fancy. A lot of the making it sound great happens in the editing phase. So if you can spend $100 on a mic, but you can get a SM57 or 58 used for probably $50, and those are wonderful dynamic mics. You'll want to learn a little bit about mic patterns as far as what they're picking up, how the recording field works, and I think I wrote some articles for the blog about that. So you're welcome to message me privately too if you want more information about that stuff. But you don't need to go out and spend $600 on a fancy podcasting mic. Um, Most people can't actually hear the difference, and most podcasting platforms are going to want you to squish it to an MP3 192, and you're going to lose a lot of that fidelity anyway.
Yeah, and I wanted to thank Valerie has put a link in the chat, so have a look at that for some good resources. And I just wanted to
Paul,
also
link
to jump in
yours.
and sorry,
No, Jean Paul, link yours too.
yeah, John Paul,
Link your
link yours
blog.
too.
Link your blog.
Link your blog. And I just wanted to say, Valerie, you mentioned an acoustic space. Obviously, I'm just in a big room right now, but I have a friend who does voiceover work, like freelance, and he sets up in his closet because the clothes he's got kind of a, sort of a quasi walk-in closet, and the hanging clothes around kind of dampen the sound so it doesn't get a lot of echo and stuff. So it doesn't have you don't have to have like a studio. I have another friend who records in their bathroom. Luckily, they can leave the door open, but they just put like towels. They kind of take the towels and sort of put them, kind of tack them around over the towel bars and the shower rack and stuff. So you just, you can experiment, I think, maybe play around a little bit with your mic, hear what it sounds like in different spaces in your house, and that'll help you out. Valerie, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, and you can also Google like blanket fort, and there's also like an audio box setup that you can do if you get literally just a box and foam and a microphone, and it's just a box. You don't have to make a huge space for it either. But closet is good if you can get like blankets. Basically, you can buy the kind that you would use to move furniture, kind of thing. You can buy them very easily at a Home Depot. They're not super expensive, and you can put those up to muffle sound. Uh, Basically, but when I say the blanket for it, like the other thing you do is literally just get like under your dining room table with blankets, or make like a blanket fort out of chairs like you did when you were a kid, and that can work too. There are a lot of ways to just sort of get the right acoustic space. And even if you don't have an expensive microphone, if you're controlling the space, it can help immensely to having good quality audio.
Yeah, I've seen folks, you mentioned a box. I've seen setups where it's basically like, those trifold cardboard things that people use for like science fairs, right? Like when kids are in school and they have to do the science fair and they've got the big foam, and just put like eggshell foam on that. I mean, like I said, try it out and do what you're going to do. John Paul, did I see you? Did you want to jump in on this conversation?
Yeah, I second the moving blanket. They are your friend. They are cheap. Any reflective surface, like windows, for instance, or hardwood floor, if you can dampen those, you're going to have more control over the quality of the audio. There's also Auralex, which you see on my wall over here. This stuff can be quite expensive, but this was all salvaged from a dumpster behind a recording studio. So there are other options of ways to get there, but any old blanket will do. And the deader, if you clap your hands and you hear a reflection, the more of that you can take away, the better it's going to sound.
That's a great test. I also did one as kind of underscore, especially for folks who are newer to audio work, pop filter. I'm a popper. My P's are all over. I like just and edit. You can't. I mean, I don't have the skill to edit that out. I can kind of reduce the effect of it a little bit, but it's hard. And my co-host on Be Gay Do Piracy pops their like their sh sounds. So it's just it's a mess. And there's you can again you can Google it. Like you can buy pop filters pretty cheap. You can also kind of just improvise one. They're pretty. This is a low tech part of the setup.
You
And I just
honestly,
want to apologize.
pantyhose and a hanger. That's it.
Yeah,
You can make it
yeah.
yourself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's basically all. I mean, the ones you buy, that's basically what they are often. And I just want to
And
apologize real quick. I know that my image is getting a little wonky. I had mentioned before that we're having a storm here, so sorry if I look like I'm in a weird animation rotoscope situation. I wanted to pause here really quick because I know a couple of folks in the chat have kind of self-identified as complete newbies. So we threw out the name of several programs. The two free ones that came up were Audacity and GarageBand. So just to make sure folks know, um, I think those are both available for both Mac and PC. Am I right? Is that seem right? Yeah. And those are easy to find. You can just Google them. They're pretty. There's a million tutorials, I think, on both of them, all over YouTube. But again, and I think I wrote them in the chat, but it's scrolled up now. So Audacity and GarageBand are two great free options. Tons of options that go beyond that, but lots of tutorials um, available for those as well. So thanks for bringing those. I did want to ask you guys. I often use Zencaster for remote recording because so I can record people on separate tracks. Is that something y'all have worked with, or okay? It's
I,
a
I I have a field recorder. So if I'm going to a con and I want to interview somebody, I have a little Tascam DR7 fits in your pocket, and gets great quality recordings. You can record for a few hours. So if I do anything remotely, it's that. And actually, the first few episodes of Simultaneous Times were recorded with nothing but the field recorder.
yeah,
So
and
we
those are
started off.
not super expensive.
You can get one for less than $100, and they're pretty amazing tools. I've had one for, shoot, it's got to be almost 20 years old, and it's still doing great.
Yeah, since I'm
Well,
I'm doing mostly exclusively narrative stuff for the most part, we just receive our narrations from the actors and then they get edited into the episode format. So I don't usually do a lot of live stuff. I know that some people who do it, what they use is either Skype, which honestly I have found to be very glitchy. I would not, but that's just my personal experience. But Zoom, people do a lot of stuff over Zoom. And then what can often be done is if you are doing it over Zoom, both of you run Audacity in the background to record the audio simultaneously. But also Zoom can get cranky about having multiple audio sources ongoing simultaneously, so you do have to be very aware, like test all this stuff out. Testing is a good idea. Anytime you're going to be playing these games with other people especially, you want to try to test out your equipment, your software, and theirs as well, so that you can try to minimize the frustration when these things come up.
I just dropped a link in the chat too to a blog post I did for Dream Foundry that's freeware solutions, for
mm,
podcasting. So that'll cover a bunch of different software. And I also wanted to mention real quickly with the popper stopper, which is essential in a real bind, you can just throw a sock over your microphone and that'll help too. Also, it'll stop with the plosives because with p's and syllables like that we will actually spit a little bit, so it's blocking the spit from hitting the mic. But also another issue, people love this tip, and I was so glad to be turned on to it. My voice can be real smacky. I drink a lot of coffee, that's probably why. But if you eat one bite of green apple, it will change the chemistry of your mouth and eliminate that smackiness, which can be very difficult to edit out. So, odd thing for your toolkit, but green apples.
that's fascinating.
Yeah,
Cool.
if you
I've
don't
never
have a
heard
green
that
apple
before.
handy, yeah, if you don't have a green apple handy, something like a lemony drink can also something, yeah, just like throw a little lemon in some water. But yeah, the mouth noise is not fun to hear later.
Unless you're doing some kind of really specific ASMR thing, you're gonna want to. Yeah. Sorry, Valerie. I didn't. And I wanted to thank Amanda for jumping in the chat and kind of seconding some of our thoughts about Audacity. I mean, it's probably one of the default things, but I just again want to underscore what I think you both said: trial and error, y'all. This is, it's just ones and zeros, right? Unless you're out like John Paul mentioned, that recording at a con or something, those things you can't sort of recreate. But if you're just recording for yourself, you're recording your intro or you're doing a narrative piece, try it out. Try it one way, try it a different way, monkey around with the settings, change your space, it's just ones and zeros. You haven't lost anything but that little chunk of time, and it's totally kind of worth it. Again, speaking of audio, I don't know if you guys are starting to hear my thunder. So I apologize if so. So we have some great links in the chat, for different resources, from both Valerie and Jean Paul. Great places to go to. I hope you guys will take note of that. Are there any other like specific? Are there specific streamers or YouTube channels or books or other kinds of specific resources that you would sort of point folks to?
A lot of the books about podcasting I've looked at are very 101 and sort of generic, not geared towards narrative podcast, for instance. Um, I've written, I don't know, a couple dozen articles about podcasting on Dream Foundry. Hopefully, those are helpful. They're all geared towards beginners, and they go over a wide variety of topics, anything from something more in depth like spatial dynamics, just to getting started, and how to deal with mixing spoken word, which can be very different than mixing a singer, for instance. Um, there's a really wonderful book called The Sound Effects Bible, where if you're interested in going into, using Foley and sound effects and taking a more sound design approach, that book is really wonderful and helpful. It goes over all the tools that you'll need, how to deal with mixing them, and that's also a way that you can earn some passive income if you're building sample libraries. You can sell that sort of thing on the side through um, royalty-free sites like Pond5 and whatnot.
Valerie?
Yeah, I'm honestly going to just defer to Jean Paul on this one because basically the Escape Artists audio producers put together a really great document that I have already linked, and that it has a lot of kind of basic information about space considerations, microphones, file formats, programs, that kind of thing. But otherwise, Jean Paul knows what's up.
There's also a lot of wonderful online classes, a lot of which you can take for free on MOOCs like Coursera, sites like that. I've taken a lot of engineering and sound design classes. Well, there'll be 101 classes, but then there'll be in-depth classes on synthesis and whatnot. There's the Hal Leonard classes, depending on how much study you want to do. I mean, there's no better way to learn than just by doing it. But there's a lot of free resources out there. I would caution though, if you're going into YouTube tutorials and stuff, they're not always taught by people that really know what they're doing. So there is bad information out there. But most of the resources for MOOCs have good engineering classes to get you started learning how to use a DAW.
Yeah. And just look around, like our local library where I did the podcast, my co-host taught a little, we got like a grant to teach text skills to the community. And so he did like I think it was a 6 session getting started in podcasting class. So which you would never necessarily, I don't think I would necessarily have turned, to the library for a source, but you don't know what might be around either online or in your community, but check out the source of it, like John Paul said, maybe have a little grain of salt there. So we have a great question that kind of, oh, I'm sorry, Valerie, did you want
Just
to
very random
chime in?
aside, depending on your local libraries or nearby libraries, my local library in Miami had a sound booth. You literally could rent it out for free. You just reserve it, and you could go record in their sound booth. It's a thought. Check it
Yeah.
out. You may find that one of your local, free public service options has something like that for you.
Yeah, definitely check that out here just in my local area. The public access television station in Knoxville has you have to join, I think it's $25 a year. And you can use their video and audio equipment. So if what you're doing, if you want to do a podcast that's also, on video, it's literally like for the cost of the $25. And then the library in Dolly Parton's hometown. This is not a big city in Sevierville, Tennessee has a exactly that what you're talking about, a little sound booth, a sound studio you can rent, so, or not rent, but sign out for. So yeah, definitely check into some of those kinds of resources, because in my experience, those people are thrilled. They are often, at least in this area, underused because people don't know about them, and those folks are delighted when when people approach them and are interested in it. I think it's one thing podcasters and streamers and stuff, we like to talk about podcasts. We like to podcast, but we also like to talk about podcasting. So we have a great question, and I think this is a good kind of follow up to some of the tech conversations we were having a little earlier, from Stephen, asking about hosting services. So I use Libsyn, which is what my original host recommended. And I can't remember who started us off last time. Let's start. I think you started, Valerie. I don't remember. Let's start with you, Valerie, because you were the last
I
one
was
who
gonna
spoke
say
on this
I
one.
didn't, but I think that Jean-Paul would know better than I would on this one
Okay.
because most of, like I said,
Okay.
most of the work that I do is not on the like full production side of things, and so
Gotcha.
to
Gotcha.
me, I would say my only thought would be to, as much as possible, when possible, because you're going to want to disseminate to all the available
Hmm.
services, Apple Podcasts and all this stuff, but like as much as possible, try to control where your thing is hosted so that if something happens, you don't lose it. That's basically the only kind of like, if you can do that, if you can have the file hosted somewhere that you are in charge of, as opposed to ending up with like the equivalent of when Amazon decides to delist a book and now the book is gone. Bye bye.
Hmm.
You don't
Right.
want that to happen if at all possible. But anyway.
Great advice, John Paul. Did you wanna extend this
Yeah,
conversation about hosting?
definitely back up your stuff on a hard drive because you don't want to lose all of your hard work. There's Lisbon, there's Podomatic. Most of the hosting servers will have a free tier to get you started, but as soon as you start eating up the storage and bandwidth, you'll have to start paying. But there are some free options if you don't have the resources to do that. And all of those will have access to the different directories where you can choose where your podcast is available. And you want to click most of those, unless you don't want it available in certain regions for some reason. But there's some other options to do it for free as well. RadioForAll.net is, I'll get a link for that in a second, is a really good one. That's a free host, and one of the cool things about that is certain radio stations you can click a box that says you can download this for rebroadcast, and certain radio stations might actually pick up your podcast, like ours for instance is played on a radio station in Northern California pretty regularly. There's also things like Bandcamp, which is often overlooked for podcasts, but a lot of bands use it. And a cool thing there is you can use that to raise funds a little bit. You can have people, you can make the episode cost $1, or there's a pay what you want option where people might donate to you. There's also things like SoundCloud, although their quality has kind of gone down over the years, but there's some free options if you don't have the money um, to pay for one of the hosting services.
And I know some of this stuff might sound intimidating, like folks who are contemplating starting out. Um, all this talk about, MOOCs and, you know, file formats and hosting and stuff. Um, I don't want to, I mean, I just want to demystify a little bit. I am not an audio engineer at all. Like, definitely. I'm not even particularly techie. Um, there's a learning curve, but you can learn it. So and as both our panelists have said, there's some great resources. So, so this is, I don't know that we could demystify the whole process in the 15 minutes that we have left, but it can be demystified. It's not as uh I don't know, it's not as dense as I think it might sound. So if you're listening to this and you're like thinking, "Oh my gosh, it's fine, it's good." Are there any other kind of production back end tech things that we need to tell folks about? Because I do want to talk a little bit about about the creative side. Um, any other tech stuff we need to touch on? Do y'all think, John Paul? Anything we've overlooked?
There's a few very simple things that are really important. For instance, I think one of the main mistakes people make in recording is forgetting to hit record. Um, I've done it before. If you're recording a 45-minute story, you're going to be really upset that you didn't hit that record button. So you want to check that every now and then. Um, And you also want to make sure that you test your levels before you start recording. If it's going into the red and peaking out, that's going to cause digital artifacts, which sound terrible, and there's nothing really you can do about getting rid of them. I always record with some extra headroom, which basically means, there's that yellow between the green and the red on your VU meter. And I like to keep it in the green, so I have some options. I can raise it up if I need to, but if it's peaked out, you can't necessarily lower it after the fact. So keeping an eye on your levels is very important. Also, for narrative podcast or for talking interview podcast and stuff, um, you're going to make mistakes in your reading, and you're going to flub lines and things like that. It's no big deal. That can always be taken out during the editing process. That's where you're going to be spending most of your time. I know I've had voice actors come in where they think they need to nail the whole half an hour piece, and that's next to impossible to do. So it's totally fine if you make a mistake. And one of the things I do to make those mistakes easy to identify and fix is, if I know I've messed up a line, I'll clap and give myself a transient spike in the waveform so that I can see where the mistake was. And when I'm editing, I know that I need to address that area.
Anything you want to add, Valerie?
There was something and I think I forgot what it was, but yeah, the clapping is very good. Oh, control the space. Like when you have an audio space, especially if you're doing narrative, less so if you're doing podcasts, but because narrative, you may be recording something long form over multiple takes, so over a period of time, and you may not be just sitting down and doing it all at once. Just make sure that you don't change the space, because it will change the audio, and that may end up sounding very strange. And so you don't want to change horses midstream, basically. And then the other thing in terms of checking levels, if you are doing something that you and someone else are recording simultaneously, especially if you're doing it over something like Zoom, just do make sure to check everyone's levels before you begin, because you don't want to have some people be very loud, some people be very quiet. It's a thing you can fix in post, but if you can avoid, like, the adage, I'll fix it in post, is like, here's a problem for future me. It's true. It is a problem for future you. Future you may in fact hate your guts by the time that they become present you. And so, to the extent that it's possible to avoid dumping problems on future you, it's a good idea.
Yeah, it's almost always easier, to fix it beforehand or as you go, than in editing. And I just want to second what you said, John Paul, about not worrying, not stressing about getting it perfect. My podcasts are interview format, they're chat formats rather than narrative. And I always have a little, chat while we're checking levels and stuff with my guests, and just tell them, look, if you get tangled up, if you, stumble over words, or you just want to say something a different way, like you say it and then you think, I wish I'd said that another way, just, we can do that. Like that's super, super easy. That is literally the easiest thing to fix in podcasting, because all you have to do is stop talking, clap, start talking again. It's fine.
And
And then when you're editing it, it just snip. That's the easiest part of editing, is snipping stuff out. Jean Paul?
and you will make mistakes no matter what. I had a friend come over recently when I was recording an episode, and they were in the studio with me and said, "Oh my God, I can't believe you make so many mistakes. I thought you were this perfect reader." I said, "No, all of that's the magic of editing. I probably flub every other line and mispronounce words and have to go back and fix it. Nobody's a perfect speaker. If you're listening to someone's podcast and you're intimidated by that, know that they spent a lot of time editing. Nobody gets every line right, and
Yeah.
you mispronounce your own name after you've been narrating for a really long time.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I recorded the outro for one of my podcasts probably, I don't know, 15 times. And I hated the way my voice sounded in my mouth by the time I was done saying it. I was like, oh no. Um, I guess we have just over 10 minutes, so I do want to talk a little bit about the creative side. I'm kind of assuming, and please in the chat jump in if that's if this is an incorrect assumption. I feel like a lot of people who are thinking about podcasting are doing it because they already have some ideas. You already have kind of in your mind like what sort of content, or maybe you've got a hobby or an interest, or you've written some stuff you want to do. So that may not be, maybe that's not right, but I feel like often that's the case, is that you start with the content. Um, and so I just wanted to open it up to back to John Paul and Valerie. I know, Val, you mostly do narrative, right? And John Paul, you sounds like you do both. Is that fair to say? Yeah. So tell me a
Mostly
little bit
narrative.
about that front end process rather than the back end, the production, the tech stuff. When you're coming up, like what what do you look for? Like what makes good content in your view for a podcast, Jean Paul?
Um, well, great stories.
Okay.
Great stories and interesting subjects, definitely. However, not every story works in audio format. I've had to turn down stories that I thought were absolutely brilliant because certain things would be lost in audio. For instance, wordplay doesn't translate particularly well to being read out loud. If you're not able to look at the page, you know, or if for instance if you're doing poetry, if it's graphic concrete poetry where the shape along the page is important, you're going to lose all of that. um, and vice versa as well. There are some things that will work in audio format that won't work particularly well on the page. For instance, every now and then we'll do a fake commercial randomly, and if you were reading that in an anthology or in a magazine, it would make no sense whatsoever. But in audio, we have this ability to present it in a different way. One thing I think is really important in your story selection, if you're doing narrative podcast, is to read the submission out loud. If it's a story you like, read it out loud, see if it's going to work. I just put in the chat a second ago, in science fiction, you often get long sentences with really complicated techno babble. If you could hear my outtakes reel, I'm cussing up a storm going, oh my God, this sentence is impossible to read. How am I going to get this right? So you may have to do it over and over again. But I think reading the pieces out loud before recording will give you a really good sense of what's going to work in audio versus what isn't.
Valerie, you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, some of the tough stuff that we've gotten that will be, say, an email where it's like, here is the email text that you get at the top of an email, and I'm like, I don't know that reading that is going to be particularly awesome. We had an amazing story from an author that had basically like informational feedback from tiny robots, and it was like, here's this log basically, and reading the entire log, and each of the logs was very kind of repetitive, um, would have been a lot. And so I loved the rest of the story so much that I worked with the author to basically pare down the logs to sort of the most essential parts of it that were non-repetitive but that reinforced the story. So that is the kind of thing that you end up with, like, um, you can either just reject the story outright and say, no, we're not going to do this. Or in the case of original fiction, helpfully, then you can sometimes work with the author to be like, all right, this particular thing is not going to work super well in audio. Can we revise it so that it will? And then the other challenges will be, for example, having multiple narrators. We have a budget. We pay our narrators. And so a story with that requires multiple narrators, unless we can get volunteers to do some of the parts, as we just did in a story we had called Hey George that came out, having to pay multiple narrators honestly becomes a financial consideration. Budgets are what they are. And technobabble as well, definitely, like Jean Paul said, we just are having very soon, I think it's next week actually, the CRISPR cookbook, a guide to biohacking your own abortion in a post-Roe world. And that one is all technobabble. And it's not even technobabble, it's literally scientific terms. And we had to find a narrator who was comfortable, pronouncing and reading those scientific terms in the context that they're being delivered. So those are definitely all considerations. Will it sound good? Will you be able to hear it and understand what's going on? Because any kind of confusion, like wordplay, for example, is going to impede understanding of the story, and you definitely don't want that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think Vanessa thinks you have a great point in the chat. And you run into this a lot with speculative fiction, is just pronouncing things. Made up people's names, made up characters' names, made up place names, can be as hard or harder than technobabble sometimes.
Yeah,
Um,
and we always request pronunciation guides from our authors. That's something that, and a good narrator will ask also, by the way, like if there is a word they don't know how to pronounce, they will come back to us and say, how is this pronounced? How does the author want this pronounced? Because again, you're trying to make sure that the author's vision is realized. And so if the author has a specific way of pronouncing a word or a thing, a name, whatever, you want it to be reflected. And so that's just part of the business, and part of, you work that into the schedule. You build in, the time that is necessary to do that kind of legwork.
I
Yeah.
find with particularly with fantasy authors, I'll usually ask for pronunciation guide where I'll have them spell it phonetically for me, or even better, have them and with a lot of people's names too. I want to make sure I'm pronouncing everybody's names correctly, whether it's the fictional character or the author. I'll ask them to just record into their phone certain words that I'm not sure of the pronunciation, and then I'll write it out phonetically on the script so that I can make sure to get that right. Because especially in speculative fiction, this comes up a lot.
And I didn't warn you guys I was going to ask this, but I'm thinking as we're talking, is there a perfect length? Like, do you have a, because I know like there's actual play podcasts for, tabletop role playing games that are 5 hours long. And then there was a wonderful one about rocks. I can't remember what the actual title was. It was like 5 minutes long. So literally the whole spectrum is out there. Do you think is there a sweet spot, Valerie, for the length of a podcast?
So for our purposes, I would say for each individual episode, we try to max out at 7,500 words, but usually the sweet spot is under five, because under 5,000 words will get you an episode that is roughly a half an hour long, usually maybe like 35 minutes with intro and outro, give or take. And so that is typically what we try to aim for as a narrative fiction podcast. That said, there are longer ones like you could do. I feel like the kind of natural lengths you have the TikTok length, which is your bite-sized experience that people are just, scrolling and enjoying and sharing. You have the kind of like 5 minute length where typically it is you are conveying something very specific about a very specific topic. And I think that usually slots more into self-help than into narrative. And then you could have like a flash length, a short story length. And we also do novelettes, but we typically then break those out into multiple episodes because they are so much longer.
Jean Paul, do you think there's a sweet spot for time? What do you shoot for your
Well,
lengths?
the longer it is, the more time you're going to spend editing. So a lot of that depends on your time constraints. Also, since we pay the writers, what can I afford per word for this particular episode? Our episodes tend to be between 20 and 40 minutes. Um, I'm not sure the audience preference. I think it depends on what sort of podcast you're producing. But I think for someone who's looking into getting to podcast, you need to consider your time constraints and your financial constraints. If I have two 8,000 word stories, that's going to be a several hour podcast, and it's going to cost me significantly more than if I'm buying a few pieces of Flash. And we try to have at least two stories in every episode.
And like check out what other people are doing in the podcast sphere that you want to break into. And so if it is something like I Should Be Writing or Ditch Diggers, where you're talking about writing at the craft of writing versus the business of writing, something like writing excuses, look at how long those tend to be. Look at how long single person podcasts tend to be versus multiple people podcasts, because that can also vary. If you have a conversation going, then you can potentially go a little bit longer. If it's an interview format, same thing. Depending on who you're interviewing, you may be able to go a little bit longer. Versus if it's just you talking, think about like how soon will my audience get bored?
Will they be sick of my voice? I get
Yeah.
it. Yeah. Well, we have a couple of minutes left before we need to release folks, and I just was hoping that each of you could say maybe one thing. If there's, we've talked about a lot. There's some great resources in the chat. I mean, we could talk for a long time. This could be longer than any podcast if we wanted to include everything about podcasting, right? But what's one thing you hope folks will take away? Valerie?
This is extremely doable. Don't get inside your own head and freak out about it. Like, take it easy, take it slow, have fun. Like the Magic School Bus, take chances, make mistakes, get messy.
Jean Paul?
Um, like any art form, you can go infinitely deep into it. It's one of the things I love about the arts with writing. You can never perfect the craft. There is always more to learn. That being said, you don't need to be a master of the skill set to do this. You can start today. There's free tools, and you will learn as you go. You will get better as you go. Um, you can do as deep a dive as you want, but you don't have to. With narrative fiction podcast, this is about storytelling. It's not about being a gearhead and super into tech. You can do both if you want to, but the stories come first, and that's how we want to connect with each other. That's why we write and read and listen to fiction, is to hear each other's stories. And, writing is a form of telepathy. You get to be in someone else's mind briefly. That's what's important. And people will forgive poor audio quality if it's a wonderful story. So don't get too bogged down in the tech element of things.
Thank you both very much. I hope you guys in the room, if you have other questions, please feel free to hop over if you're not already in the Discord chat and feel free to reach out to me or to Valerie or Jean Paul with your questions. And try it out. And please, if y'all start a podcast, you guys let us know. I'd love to, kind of have a chance to check out your efforts. Thanks everybody. We're gonna let you go so you can have time to get to your next things. Thanks so much for coming, and thank you, Valerie and Jean Paul. Thank you so much for lending us your expertise. Thank
Thank you,
you.
Jen.
Thank
Bye,
you for
guys.
moderating.